She stood at the altar while the whole town laughed. Her groom walked away without looking back. She had nothing left. No family, no future, no dignity. Then a stranger rode out of the mountains, a man everyone feared, and did something no one in Red Hollow ever expected. He looked at her, really looked at her, and held out his hand. What happened next would change everything. If you're watching this story, hit like now, and comment the name of the city you're watching in, so I know how far my story has progressed. Don't miss out. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The dress had taken Clara Whitmore 4 months to finish. She had sewn it herself because there was no one else to do it, and because buying one from Mabel Crouch's dry goods store would have meant listening to Mabel's opinions about the whole affair, and Clara had heard enough opinions to last her several lifetimes. She had cut the fabric from a bolt of ivory muslin she ordered by post, unpicked the seams twice when the fit came out wrong, and finally, on the last week of September, she had held it up in the light coming through her bedroom window and thought that it looked all right. Not beautiful, maybe, but all right. She had allowed herself that much. Red Hollow was not a town that encouraged women like Clara Whitmore to think too highly of themselves. It was a frontier settlement pressed up against the eastern foothills of the Caldwell Range, a place of mud streets and wooden storefronts, and people who had come from somewhere else and hadn't found what they were looking for and were quietly bitter about it. There were maybe 300 souls in Red Hollow, if you counted the homesteaders who came in for supplies on Saturdays. Clara had lived among them her entire 26 years, had grown up in the house her father built on the north end of town before his lungs gave out, had worked the counter at Hargrove's Feed and Seed since she was 14, and she knew every face and every voice and every opinion that had ever been formed about her. The opinions were not complicated. Clara Whitmore was fat. That was the beginning and end of it, as far as Red Hollow was concerned. She was a big woman, wide through the shoulders and heavy through the hips, and she had been that way since childhood, and no amount of smaller portions or longer walks had changed it, and she had eventually accepted that it was not going to change. The town had never quite accepted the same thing. There was always someone with an observation to make. A remark dropped at the general store, a laugh half swallowed when she walked past the saloon, a particular way that certain women in town looked at her that made her feel like something that didn't quite belong in the landscape. She had learned to carry it like a stone in her boot. You stopped noticing after a while. Or you told yourself you did. The engagement to Douglas Pell had come about through a combination of desperation and poor judgment, mostly Douglas's, as it turned out, though Clara had done her share of not looking closely enough at what was right in front of her. Douglas ran the livery at the south end of town and had a pleasant face and an easy way of talking that Clara had mistaken for about 7 months for genuine warmth. He had come calling in the spring, and she had cooked for him, and he had eaten well and talked about his plans for expanding the livery. And somewhere in there he had mentioned that a man needed a wife who could run a household, and Clara had said that she supposed he did. And the next week he had produced a ring that was slightly too small, and had asked her to marry him in a way that was more matter-of-fact than romantic. She had said yes because she was 26 and tired, and because she thought maybe this was how it happened for people like her, not with grand declarations but with practicality and a ring that didn't quite fit. She did not tell herself it was love. She wasn't sure she believed in love anymore, not the kind the songs talked about, but she believed in companionship and shared work and not being alone in the world, and she had thought Douglas Pell might give her those things. She found out otherwise on the morning of October the 4th. The ceremony was set for 10 o'clock in the open square at the center of town, because Red Hollow didn't have a proper church, just a fellowship hall that smelled of mildew and mice and doubled as a meeting room for the town council. Reverend Alcott, who wasn't actually an ordained reverend but had read enough scripture to pass for one in a place this remote, had agreed to officiate. The whole town turned out, not because they were fond of Clara or because they wished her well, but because people in small frontier towns did not have a great deal of entertainment, and a wedding was a wedding. Clara had walked to the square alone. There was no father to walk beside her, no brother, no one. She had dressed herself in the ivory dress and pinned her hair up as best she could and walked the 3 blocks from her house with her chin level and her hands clasped in front of her and the stone in her boot sitting heavier than usual. The crowd had parted when she arrived. She remembered that. The way they stepped aside and looked at her, and not the way people look at a bride, that particular softness, but with a curiosity that had something harder underneath it. She heard somebody say something she didn't catch, and then a ripple of laughter, low and quickly suppressed, and she had kept her eyes on the wooden platform that served as the altar and told herself to keep walking. Douglas was not there yet. She waited. Reverend Alcott was there, sweating in his good coat, looking at his watch. The townspeople were there, arranged in a rough semicircle, talking among themselves in voices pitched just low enough that she couldn't quite make out the words. The sun was already fierce for October, beating down on the square without mercy, and Clara stood in it and waited. At 10 past 10, Roy Tillman came through the crowd. Roy worked at the livery with Douglas, a lean young man with a sunburned neck who had never in Clara's memory managed to look her in the eye. He was not looking at her now either. He was looking at the ground between them. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Roy. Douglas asked me to—" Stopped, started again. "He said to tell you he's sorry." Clara looked at him. "Sorry?" "He said—" Roy's jaw worked. "He said he thought it over and he doesn't think it's going to work out. He's already gone. Took the early stage." The silence that followed was about 2 seconds long. Clara counted them. Then someone laughed. She didn't see who. It didn't matter who. The laugh spread the way fire spreads through dry grass, from one person to the next, quick and thoughtless. And within a moment, it had moved through the whole crowd, people turning to each other and grinning, somebody saying, "I told you," to somebody else. And Clara stood in the middle of it in her ivory dress, with the sun on her face, and her hands still clasped in front of her, and the whole world rearranged itself into something she didn't have a word for. Not sadness. Not quite. Something that sat in the chest like a weight and made it hard to breathe. She did not cry. She made a decision, right there in that moment, that she was not going to cry in front of these people. That was the one thing she had. She was not going to let them take it. She stood straight. She unclenched her hands. She looked out at the crowd, all these faces she had known her whole life, laughing at her, and she looked at them one by one and let them look back, and she did not flinch. But she didn't know what to do next. That was the honest truth of it. She had no plan for this. She had a plan for the wedding and for the life that came after, and for the adjustments that would be required and the compromises and the slow business of making something work. But she had no plan for standing in a town square in a dress she sewed herself, while the people she had lived among her entire life laughed themselves breathless at her misfortune. So she just stood there. That was when she heard it, the sound of hooves coming down the mountain road, deliberate and unhurried, cutting through the noise of the crowd. Rhett Blackstone was not a man that Red Hollow's people were comfortable with, even on the best of days. He came into town maybe 3 or 4 times a year to trade pelts and pick up supplies, and on those days the saloon got a little quieter when he walked in, and the men who were usually quick with opinions found pressing business elsewhere. He was not a large man, no taller than average, built lean and hard the way mountain men got built, with calloused hands and a face that had been weathered by altitude and cold into something angular and unreadable. He kept a beard trimmed short, had dark hair that was starting to silver at the temples, and wore the same kind of battered canvas coat every time Clara had seen him, with a long-bladed knife on his left hip and a rifle slung across his back that he carried the way most men carried umbrellas. He was somewhere in his mid-30s. He spoke rarely. He looked at people with gray eyes that gave nothing away and seemed to see considerably more than most people were comfortable with. There were stories about Rhett Blackstone the way there were stories about any man who lived alone in rough country and didn't explain himself. Stories about fights he'd been in, men he'd run off his land, a confrontation with a group of claim jumpers 2 winters back that had ended badly for the claim jumpers. Clara didn't know which of the stories were true. She doubted anyone in town did. He rode into the square on a dark bay mare that looked as trail-worn and self-possessed as its rider, and the crowd's laughter dried up the way water dries up on hot rock, instantly and completely. He stopped at the edge of the crowd and looked at the scene in front of him. His eyes moved across it the way a man reads a situation, assessing, cataloging. Clara watched him do it. She watched him take in the platform and the reverend and the crowd and the lack of a groom, and finally, Clara herself in her ivory dress standing in the middle of it all. He sat there for a moment, Then he swung down from the horse with the economical ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, looped the reins around the hitching post, and walked into the square. The crowd parted for him without anyone making a conscious decision to move. People just stepped back. He walked straight to Clara, stopped about 3 feet from her, looked at her the way he had looked at the whole scene, direct, assessing, without any of the layered meanings that everyone else in this town packed into a look at Clara Whitmore. "You the Whitmore girl?" he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Quiet, but the kind of quiet that carries. "I am," she said. "Where's your groom?" "Gone," she said. "Took the morning stage." Rhett Blackstone nodded slowly, like this was information he was filing away somewhere. "That was a coward's move," he said. Clara laughed, which surprised her, a short, sharp sound that came out before she could stop it. "Yes," she said. "It was." He looked at her for another moment. The crowd around them was so quiet she could hear the mayor breathing behind him. "I've got a cabin up on the north face of the Caldwell Range," he said. "Been up there 8 years. It's not a fine place, but it's solid and it doesn't leak much. I could use someone who knows how to manage a household, someone practical." Clara stared at him. "Are you—" She stopped. Started again. "Are you proposing to me? Right now? In front of all these people?" "I'm making a proposal," he said. "You can call it what you like." "You don't know me," she said. "I know you work at Hargrove's and you've worked there since you were young, and Tom Hargrove has never once complained about your work. And that tells me something. I know you didn't cry when your groom left, which tells me something else." He glanced briefly at the crowd, then back at her. "And I know you're standing here straight when most people would be running. That tells me the most." Clara looked at this man she barely knew. She was aware, acutely aware, of every pair of eyes in the square trained on the two of them. She was aware of what they were thinking, that Rhett Blackstone had lost his mind, or was making a joke at her expense, or had been up on the mountain too long and couldn't tell a marriageable woman from a— She stopped that thought. "If I say yes," she said carefully, "I need you to know that I will not be something you feel sorry for. I won't be a charity case, and I won't be grateful in a way that shrinks me. If I come to your mountain, I'll carry my weight." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile. More like the slight adjustment a man makes when something he expected to be one thing turns out to be another. "I know that," he said. "That's why I'm asking." Clara Whitmore stood in her ivory dress in the middle of Red Hollow's town square, with the sun overhead and the laughter gone cold around her. And she thought about everything she had in this town. The house with its leaking roof. The job at Hargrove's that would be considerably more uncomfortable now. The faces watching her right now with that particular brand of pity that was worse than mockery, because at least mockery didn't pretend to care. She thought about the stone in her boot. "All right," she said. "Yes." The crowd erupted, not in congratulation, but in the disbelieving, half-scandalized noise of people who had expected a spectacle and received a completely different one than they'd planned for. She heard "Lord have mercy" from somewhere to her left, and "He's lost his mind" from someone else, and a woman saying to her companion, "She'll be back inside a month," with the confident satisfaction of someone who has never been wrong about anything. Clara turned and walked with Rhett Blackstone to his horse. She didn't look back at the crowd. She didn't have anything to say to them. She did notice, as she passed the hitching post, that the ivory dress was going to be completely wrong for the mountains. She was already thinking about what to replace it with. They were married 3 days later by a circuit judge passing through a town called Barlow's Creek, 18 miles east of Red Hollow. The ceremony took approximately 4 minutes and involved no flowers, no crowd, and no laughter. The judge's wife signed as witness. Afterward, the judge's wife pressed Clara's hand and said, "You look practical," in a tone that Clara chose to take as a compliment. Rhett paid for lunch at the town's only restaurant, a place with 4 tables and a cook who seemed personally offended by the act of cooking, and they ate in something close to silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, more the kind that settles between two people who have both decided to stop performing and see what's actually there. "You should know," Rhett said, somewhere in the middle of his second cup of coffee, "that I don't talk much. Not because I have a low opinion of conversation, but because I've spent most of my time in places where there wasn't anyone to have it with. That's fine, Clara said. I don't need to fill every silence. He looked at her. Most people do. I'm not most people, she said, as has recently been demonstrated. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before it disappeared. They rode back toward the mountains in the late afternoon, Clara on a borrowed horse that the judge's wife had arranged, with a single trunk of belongings tied to the back of Rhett's saddle. Everything she'd decided to bring, which was considerably less than everything she owned. She had sold the house before they left. She had not said goodbye to anyone in Red Hollow except Tom Hargrove, who had shaken her hand and told her he hoped she knew what she was doing, and she had said she probably didn't, but that she was doing it anyway. The Caldwell Range rose ahead of them as they rode, the peaks gray and distant in the afternoon light, the foothills coming closer with every mile. Clara watched the mountains and thought about what she was riding toward and what she was riding away from, and she did not let herself be afraid of either one. She was afraid, of course. She would have been a fool not to be. She was riding into country she didn't know with a man she barely knew, and she had nothing to fall back on if it went wrong. But fear had never been a reason to stay somewhere that was eating her alive, and Red Hollow had been doing that since she was old enough to understand what the looks meant. At least the mountains wouldn't look at her like that. The cabin was not what she had expected, which was both better and worse in different measures. It was better because it was solid, built from logs so thick you could barely span them with both arms, with a roof that didn't leak except in one corner. Rhett pointed out matter-of-factly, as though leaks were a feature he'd grown accustomed to, and a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall and threw serious heat when it was going. It was set on a bench of land about 2/3 of the way up the north face, sheltered on 3 sides by pines so old and tall they created their own weather. There was a creek 20 yards downhill, a well dug just outside the door, a small outbuilding where Rhett kept his tools and supplies, and a view from the front step that on clear days extended all the way south to where the plains started, flat and brown and enormous. It was worse because it was small. One main room, one sleeping area divided from the main room by a heavy curtain, a loft above where Rhett kept extra traps and equipment. The floor was packed earth except near the fire where he'd laid down flat stones. The one window looked west and let in the afternoon sun, but not much else. The entire place smelled of wood smoke and animal hides and the particular cold mineral smell of mountain air coming under the door. Clara stood in the middle of the main room with her trunk beside her and looked at all of it, and said nothing for a long moment. I know it's not much, Rhett said from the doorway. He hadn't come inside yet, as if he was waiting to see what she made of it. It's functional, she said, because it was, and because she was not going to be the kind of woman who complained about the things she'd walked into deliberately. The chimney draws well? Better than you'd expect. The roof, that one corner, we'll need to fix it before deep winter. I was planning to. What else needs doing? He looked at her for a moment. The chinking on the east wall needs work. Drafty in January. The door on the outbuilding doesn't hang right. Creek needs clearing upstream. There's a blockage that'll cause problems when the snowmelt comes. All right, she said. She set her coat on the table and rolled up her sleeves. Show me where you keep the tools. The first month was the hardest education of Clara's life, and she had not had an easy education to begin with. She had known hard work. She was not under any illusions about that. Working a feed store counter for 12 years was not light duty. The lifting, the inventory, the long hours on her feet, the way Tom Hargrove's bookkeeping system required half an hour of interpretation before it made sense. She had kept a house alone since her father died when she was 20, had managed her own repairs and winter preparations in food stores. She was not delicate. She had never been delicate. But the mountain had a different understanding of what hard meant. The first week, she burned her hands on the fire grate and cut her palm on a saw blade and fell twice on the ice that formed overnight on the path to the outbuilding. She skinned a rabbit Rhett brought in and ruined the pelt, and he showed her the right cut without any particular emotion in his voice, just the information, and she did it over until she got it right. She learned to read the sky the way he did. The particular color and texture of clouds that meant weather coming fast. The shift in wind that preceded a temperature drop. The sound the pines made in a coming storm versus the sound they made in a passing wind. She was slow at all of it, and she was very aware of being slow, and she did not let that stop her. Rhett was a patient teacher, which surprised her. She didn't know exactly what she had expected. Some version of the hard, closed-off man everyone in town described. And there were moments when he was that. When he came back from a day of checking traps, not wanting conversation, or when something troubled him that he wouldn't name, and he went silent in a way that felt like a wall. But when she asked him to teach her something, he taught her. Directly, without condescension, and without the particular variety of mansplaining she had experienced from virtually every man she'd ever worked alongside who thought he knew more than her. He showed her how to set the traps he used for marten and fox and beaver, showed her the game trails that ran through the property and how to read the signs animals left, showed her how to judge ice thickness on the creek, how to clear a chimney, how to dress game so that nothing was wasted. He showed her once, slowly, and then he expected her to do it. And if she did it wrong, he told her specifically what was wrong and let her try again. "You're not what I expected," she told him one evening, about 3 weeks in, when they were sitting on opposite sides of the fire after dinner. He looked up from the trap he was repairing. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," she said. "The town had a lot of ideas about you." "Towns usually do," he said. He went back to the trap. "What did they say?" "That you were dangerous, that you'd run men off your land, that you'd—" She paused. "There was a story about some claim jumpers." "There was," he said. He said it like a door closing. Not angry, just final. She respected the finality. "Were they wrong? The stories?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "The part about me being dangerous, that's true enough, when I need to be. The rest—" He set down the trap. "I've done things I don't particularly want to talk about. I came up here to be somewhere those things didn't follow me." "Did they follow you?" "Some of them," he said. "Some things you can't outrun by going up a mountain." Clara thought about that. She thought about the things she had carried out of Red Hollow. Not in her trunk, but in her chest, the kind of weight that didn't pack down. "No," she said. "I suppose you can't." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the same way he had in the town square. "What do you carry?" he said. The question was so direct and so unexpected that she almost laughed again. "That's a forward thing to ask a woman," she said. "You started it." Fair enough, she supposed. 26 years of being looked at like I don't belong in the world I'm standing in, she said. That doesn't go away just because the world changes. He nodded slowly. No, he said. It doesn't. But it's quieter up here. Clara looked out the window at the dark pines against the darker sky, and the stars above them so thick they looked like spillage. It is, she agreed. It's considerably quieter. By the second month, she had stopped burning herself on the grate. She had learned how to fall on ice without going over, a skill that was more about balance and instinct than she'd expected, and one that had taken a spectacular bruise on her left hip to properly absorb. She had repaired the east wall chinking herself, a project that had taken 4 days and used language she hadn't used since her father was alive. And when it was done, the draft was gone, and Rhett had run his hand along the new chinking and said, "Good work," in the same tone he might use to describe the weather. She was learning to take his compliments as the significant things they were. The isolation was its own adjustment. In Red Hollow, she had spent 12 hours a day among people, customers, Tom Hargrove, the flow of town life. She had not liked all of it, had not liked most of it if she was being precise, but it had been a structure she understood. Up on the mountain, the nearest neighbor was 6 miles south along a trail that was barely passable in good weather. The nearest town was Red Hollow, which she had no desire to return to, and the next nearest was Barlow's Creek, a day's ride down the other side of the range. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't miss the company. She missed the sense of a wider world going on somewhere. News, the way events moved through a community and gave the days a shape. But she didn't miss the people specifically. What she had up here, this quiet life with its punishing physical demands, and its early nights, and its long conversations with a man who chose every word carefully, this felt more honest than anything she had known before. What she did not expect was how much she would come to enjoy the hunting. Red had started taking her along on his rounds of the trap lines in the 3rd week, mostly because a second pair of eyes was useful, and he had decided she could keep up. She could, barely, Though the first few mornings had nearly killed her, miles of terrain that went steadily up and then precipitously down, in temperatures that dropped 20 degrees below town level, moving through snow that came to her knees in the drifts. But she had kept up, and the next week was marginally easier, and the week after that she had started to feel something in her legs and lungs that she didn't have a word for yet. Not strength exactly, but the beginning of it. The shape strength would eventually fill. She started to see things on those mornings that she had never seen before and had no idea existed. A pair of elk moving through a clearing at dawn, so large and unhurried they looked like a different order of creature than anything she had encountered. A lynx watching them from a pine branch, gray and patient, yellow-eyed, so still it was barely distinguishable from the bark. The way the snow looked at first light, before the sun hit it and washed out its colors, lavender in the shadows, pale gold on the ridges, and the sky above them enormous and pink at the rim and dark blue overhead, and moving through all of it a wind so cold and clean it almost hurt to breathe. "Is it always like this?" she asked one morning, standing on a ridge with the whole valley spread below them. Rhett was crouching by a trap, resetting it. "Like what?" She gestured at the view, at all of it, not quite finding the words. He glanced at the valley and then back at his work. "More or less," he said. "Some mornings are worse." "I meant—" She stopped. "I don't think I have the right words for it." He looked up at her then, and this time the thing at the edge of his mouth was definitely a smile, brief and crooked and quickly retracted. "You don't need them," he said. "It's not a thing you need to name." She found out about his past in pieces. The way you find things out when a person has decided what they will and won't say but cannot entirely control what shows. There had been a family, once. That much she gathered from an unguarded moment when she asked about a small photograph tucked into a crevice in the wall above the fireplace. A woman, a child, their faces weathered and faded by years in rough conditions. He had looked at the photograph for a long time before he answered her, and what he said was only, "Before." Before what? She didn't ask. Not then. She filed it and let it alone. There had been violence more than the claim jumper story suggested. She put this together from the way he moved, not with aggression, but with a particular kind of readiness that didn't switch off, a way of taking in every room and every approach from the high ground and noting exits. From the scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw that he mentioned only once, briefly, in the context of explaining something unrelated, and from the way he woke sometimes in the night and sat upright with a sound that wasn't quite a word in any language she knew. She didn't ask about those nights either. She just lay still and waited, and after a few minutes she would hear his breathing slow, and she would let herself sleep again. She had her own nights when she lay awake and replayed the scene in the town square with a precision that embarrassed her. The laughter, the way it had moved through the crowd, Roy Tillman looking at the ground. Nights when she reached into the place where her future had been and found it rearranged into something she didn't entirely recognize yet. On one of those nights, she got up and went to sit by the banked fire, the way her father had taught her when she was small and sleep wouldn't come. She sat there in the dark with the coals glowing red and the cold pressing against the walls, and after a while she heard the curtain move and Rhett came and sat in the other chair. They sat without talking for a while. The fire ticked and settled. "Couldn't sleep," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." "You think about it much? Red Hollow?" Clara considered lying and decided not to. "Sometimes. Less than I expected." He was quiet. "I think about the thing that brought me up here," he said finally. "Less than I used to, but sometimes." "Does it help, being up here?" "It helps enough," he said. "That's the most I can say for it." Clara looked at the fire. "That might be all anything can do," she said. "Help enough." He looked at her profile in the firelight. "You're a more philosophical woman than I expected," he said. And there was something in how he said it, not surprised exactly, but as though the thing she'd turned out to be was something he'd needed and hadn't known how to say so. "You keep saying that," she said, "that I'm not what you expected." "You keep being something I didn't expect," he said, and went back to looking at the fire. Thought, by winter, Red Hollow seemed like something from a previous life. Not a bad dream exactly, more like a story someone else had told her, about a woman who stood in a town square in an ivory dress while people laughed, who had made a decision most people thought was reckless or desperate or both, and had ridden up a mountain to see what was there. What was there, it turned out, was this: cold and work and silence, and a man who was broken in ways that Clara was beginning to understand, and a landscape that had no opinion of her size, and mornings so brutally beautiful they made the 30 years before them feel like prelude. She was not perfectly happy. She did not romanticize what her life had become. Her hands were rough in a way they would never recover from. Her knees ached in the cold in a way they hadn't before. There were days when the isolation pressed down and she would have given considerable money for a conversation with someone other than Rhett Blackstone, who on those days might say 11 words between dawn and supper and seemed to think that was plenty. But she was stronger than she had ever been. She had carried a mountain's worth of work through her body, and something in her had shifted, not in the way people in town had always implied she ought to shift, smaller, less, diminished, but the other direction, more capable, more herself. As though the mountain had taken what the town had been trying to sand away and built it back in a different form. She was learning who she was when no one was watching and no one was judging, and the only measure that mattered was whether she had done the work or hadn't. She had done the work. On a morning in late November, she stood on the ridge above the cabin in the blue-gray light before sunrise, her breath-making clouds in the still air, the mountains above her lit pink at the peaks and dark below, and she thought about the ivory dress at the bottom of her trunk. She had kept it, though she couldn't have said precisely why. Maybe because it was evidence of something. Not the humiliation, she was done carrying that, but the decision that came after it. The moment she had looked at Rhett Blackstone's extended hand and chosen something she didn't understand over something she'd given up on, she was glad she had. She was not going to pretend it was easy or that she knew how it would go from here, but she was glad. Below, in the cabin, she could see the first thread of smoke beginning from the chimney. Rhett was up, getting the fire going. He would have coffee started by the time she got back down. She stood for a moment more in the cold and the quiet, looking at the mountains above and the valley below, and the enormous sky beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. And then she turned and started back down the trail, moving easily over the ground she'd crossed 100 times now, her footing sure, and her breath steady, and her hands ready for whatever the day brought. Behind her, the peaks caught the first light and went white. The mountain did not care who she had been in Red Hollow. It only knew what she did here, today, in this moment, and what she was capable of. And Clara Whitmore, the bride everyone laughed at, was beginning, slowly and without ceremony, to find out. The first snow came early that year. Red had said it would, sometime in the second week of November, standing at the door of the cabin and looking at the sky with the particular expression he used when he was reading something the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet. Clara had looked at the same sky and seen clouds, gray, heavy, moving from the northwest. He had seen what was inside them. 3 days, he said. 3 days until what? Snow. Real snow. Not what we've had. She had filed that alongside the other things she was learning to trust. His read of wind direction, his instinct for which trails would freeze and which would stay passable, the way he could look at a tree line and tell her what was moving through it. 3 days later, she woke before dawn to a silence so complete it had a texture, and she understood what he'd meant by real snow. It had come in overnight, and it had not stopped. By mid-morning, the drifts against the cabin's east wall were shoulder-high on her, and the path to the outbuilding had ceased to exist. "We'll be clearing that every morning," Rhett said, handing her one of the 2 flat-bladed shovels he'd had leaning against the wall since October. "Every morning," she repeated, "until April." He pulled on his coat. "Some mornings twice." Clara picked up the shovel and followed him out into it. That was the rhythm of deep winter on the Caldwell Range. Not dramatic, not the kind of suffering that made for good stories, but a grinding, daily, unrelenting requirement to stay ahead of what the mountain threw at you. The cold was not the picturesque kind. It was a cold that got into your joints and stayed there, that turned the simple task of drawing water from the well into a 10-minute operation because the rope froze to the bucket. That made the outhouse a thing she had very strong opinions about by January. She learned to layer clothing the way Rhett did. Thin wool against the skin, heavier wool over that, canvas outside, nothing that would trap sweat and freeze against her if she worked too hard. She learned to watch her fingers and ears the way you watched a fire, not with panic, but with attention, knowing that the moment you stopped paying attention was when you got hurt. She got hurt anyway. Everyone did, Rhett told her, the first winter. It was how the mountain established the terms. Her terms were 2 sprained fingers from a slip on the woodpile in December, a burn across her right forearm, shallow but ugly, from an ember that jumped the grate on a night when the wind came down the chimney wrong, a cold that settled in her chest in late January and stayed for 3 weeks, leaving her with a cough that rattled the whole cabin and a voice that went down an octave and didn't fully come back up until March. Through all of it, she kept working, not because she was performing toughness for Rhett or for the ghost of Red Hollow watching over her shoulder, but because the work had to be done and she was one of 2 people to do it, and stopping was not a real option. The trap line still needed running, the animals still needed feeding, the wood still needed splitting. You got sick, and you worked sick, and you got better because the alternative was worse. Rhett, to his credit, did not treat her like a sick person in a way that diminished her. He took over the heavier outdoor work without comment during the worst week, and he made a soup from dried beans and smoked meat that was deeply, inexplicably good, and he left it near the fire where she could reach it without getting up. When she finally felt well enough to sit at the table rather than lying by the fire, he sat across from her with 2 cups of coffee and said, "You made it through." "I always make it through things," she said, which came out rougher than she intended because of the cough. "I know," he said. "I just meant the first bad sickness up here is the worst. Your body's still adjusting." "How long did your first one last?" "A month," he said. "I lost 12 pounds." She almost laughed, stopped herself because it would have become a coughing fit. "You could not have afforded 12 pounds, she said. "No," he agreed, and drank his coffee. What she hadn't expected, what she could not have predicted from any version of herself that existed before the mountain, was that she would come to love the trap lines. Not the trapping itself, not precisely. She had made a kind of peace with the killing that was built into it, the way you made peace with anything that was necessary and couldn't be otherwise, but she did not love that part. What she loved was the moving through it, the miles of terrain that she had come to know the way she had once known the layout of Hargrove's store, intimately, specifically, with a sense of where everything was and how it connected to everything else. She knew which creek bend the otter favored and which ridge the elk used as a windbreak. She knew the birch stand where the marten ran and the rocky outcrop above the south meadow where a pair of red foxes had denned last fall, though Rhett left that particular pair alone and didn't explain why except to say, "Let them be," which told her enough. She learned to move quietly. This was harder than it sounded because she had never been a quiet mover. She was a big woman and she moved like one, and the mountain's terrain required a different way of placing her feet, a different distribution of weight, a patience in each step that did not come naturally. Rhett showed her once, moving through a quarter-mile of packed snow without making more than a whisper of sound, and she had watched him and understood in theory what he was doing and spent the next 3 weeks failing to replicate it, and the week after that beginning, tentatively, to get it. "Better," he said one morning, when she came up behind him on a trail and he didn't hear her until she was 8 feet away. "You heard me at 8 feet, she pointed out. "I heard you at 6, he said. "Last week it was 20. She counted that. The tracks were another thing she came to know. Not just the obvious ones, the deer and the elk she'd recognized from the beginning, but the smaller stories the snow told if you looked carefully. The 3-toed drag of a rabbit that had gone under brush to hide. The long silent stride of a mountain lion that had passed through sometime in the night, its trail following the edge of a meadow with the specific purposefulness of a predator that knew where it was going. She came across that track one morning in February and stood over it for a long moment, looking at the size of the print, and felt something move through her that was not quite fear and not quite admiration, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "How close does it come?" she asked Rhett when she showed him. He crouched over the track. "Closer than this in summer," he said, "when it's hungry." "Has it ever?" "Twice," he said. He didn't elaborate, but he glanced at the long knife on his hip in a way that told her what twice had looked like. "You carry yours?" She had the smaller knife he'd given her in November, a straightforward working blade she wore on her right side. Always, she said. Good. He stood up. You see it. Make yourself big. Don't run. I know not to run from a predator. Most people know it, he said. Knowing it and doing it are different when the thing is actually in front of you. She thought about that for the rest of the morning. She thought about all the things she'd known in theory before the mountain that turned out to be entirely different in practice. Not just the physical things, but the interior ones. She had known, in theory, that she was capable of more than Red Hollow believed. She had known it without being able to prove it, which was its own particular kind of frustration. The way knowing you're right about something you can't demonstrate yet just sits in you and waits. The mountain was providing the demonstration. One cold morning at a time. It was March when she found out about the woman in the photograph. Not from Rhett. Not directly. Not voluntarily. From a man named Cord Eller, who came up the trail from the south on a gray horse with a pack mule and arrived at the cabin on a Tuesday morning when Rhett was out checking the lower trap line. Clara heard the horse first, and she came out of the outbuilding with a hatchet in her hand, which was not because she was nervous, but because she had been splitting wood and didn't put it down before she came to see who was there. The man on the horse pulled up short when he saw her and looked at the hatchet with visible wariness. I'm looking for Blackstone, he said. He was a weathered man in his 50s with a gray-streaked beard and the kind of face that had done a lot of time outdoors. Rhett Blackstone. He'll be back by noon, Clara said. She lowered the hatchet to her side but didn't put it away. You're welcome to wait. The man climbed down from his horse. Cord Eller, he said. I knew Rhett, years back, before he came up here. Clara introduced herself and put the hatchet down and made coffee, which Cord Eller accepted with the gratitude of a man who had been writing since before dawn. He sat at the table and looked around the cabin with the expression of someone who was noting changes and deciding what to say about them. Place looks different, he said finally. Different how? Better. He wrapped his hands around the cup. It had gone to hell, honestly, after everything. He stopped. He hasn't talked to you about it. Not much, she said. She sat down across from him. I haven't pushed. Cord Eller looked at her for a moment like he was taking her measure. Then he said, her name was Josie, his wife. The little girl in this picture was their daughter, May. They were living down in the valley then, had a homestead about 15 miles south of here. He turned the cup in his hands. There was a fire. Winter, maybe 7 years back. Rhett was out. He was always out. That was his nature even then. Always working the land, checking the lines. He came back and the homestead was gone. Clara was quiet. They never found out if it was accident or set, Cord said. That was the worst of it, I think, not knowing. There were some men who had an interest in that land Rhett had refused to sell. And it might have been them or it might have been a chimney spark. He spent a year trying to find out, nearly killed himself trying. Then he came up here and stopped trying. He paused. Or stopped talking about it. I'm not sure those are the same. They're not, Clara said. The sound of Rhett's boots on the step came before either of them expected it. He pushed through the door, bringing cold air and the smell of pine, and stopped when he saw Cord Eller at his table. The look on his face went through several things quickly and settled on something closed and careful. Cord, he said. Rhett. The older man stood. I was passing through the territory. Thought I'd come up. You never just passed through, Rhett said. What is it? Cord reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, which he set on the table. Rhett looked at it without touching it for a moment, then picked it up and read it. Clara watched his face. He was very good at keeping his face from doing things, but the paper made something happen at the corners of his eyes that he couldn't entirely suppress. Where did you get this? He said. Office of Land Records in Barlow's Creek. A clerk there sent word. He knew you and I had history. There's a firm, Cord said, operating out of the Eastern Territory. They've been filing claims on mountain land all across this range. They file the claims quiet, then they come and tell the people already on the land that they're trespassing. He nodded at the paper. They filed on your parcel 3 months ago. Clara felt the air in the room change the way air changed before weather. Rhett set the paper down on the table slowly. They filed a claim, he said, on land I've held for 8 years. They filed a claim, Cord confirmed. Whether it's valid or not is another matter. These outfits, they count on people not having the resources to fight it, or the will. Rhett stood very still. Clara had learned what that stillness meant. It was not peace. It was the opposite of peace. It was the moment before something that had been held in check made a decision about whether to stay held. "Who are they?" she said. Both men looked at her. "The firm," she said. "Who are they?" Cord pulled out another piece of paper, smaller, a note in a tight hand. "They operate under a few names. The main name is the Harlow Syndicate. The man who runs the operation is called Denton Voss. Wealthy man, based out of the territory capital. He's been buying up mountain land claims for 2 years. Legitimate ones where he can get them, fabricated ones where he can't." "Why mountain land?" Clara asked. "What's here that's worth that kind of effort?" Cord and Rhett exchanged a look. It was Rhett who answered. "Silver," he said. "There was a survey done 2 years back. Someone surveyed the Caldwell Range and found significant deposits through the north face." He looked at the table. "I knew about it. I didn't think it would matter. The deposits are deep, hard to get to. But if someone had the money to—" "They'd need the land first," Clara said. "They'd need the land first," he agreed. She picked up the paper Cord had brought and read it herself. The legal language was dense, but the shape of it was clear enough. A claim filed on the exact parcel Rhett's cabin sat on, dated October of the previous year. Someone had known, or suspected, and had moved while she and Rhett were still working out the terms of sharing a roof. "What happens if you don't respond to the claim?" she asked. "They get the land," Rhett said flatly. "And if you do respond?" "Then it goes to the land court in the territory capital, and whoever has the better lawyers and the more money tends to win." He looked at the paper in her hands. "Which won't be me." Clara set the paper down. She was aware of something moving in her, not fear, or not only fear, but a kind of clarifying anger that she recognized from the town square. The feeling of being expected to step aside, to accept what someone else had decided about her life, to be diminished by someone who assumed she lacked the will to fight back. She had not stepped aside in the town square. "Then we need better information than they think we have," she said. "Where is the original deed for this parcel?" Rhett looked at her. "In the strongbox under the floor," he said after a moment. "With the survey records from when I first claimed the land." "How detailed are the survey records?" "Detailed enough." She looked at Cordeller. "You said the clerk in Barlow's Creek sent word because he knew you. Is he trustworthy?" "As trustworthy as anyone in a land records office can be," Cord said carefully, which was not a ringing endorsement, but was something. "We need to know everything the Harlow Syndicate has filed in this territory," she said. "Every claim, every piece of land. If they've done this before, they've made mistakes before. And if they've made mistakes before—" "There's a pattern," Rhett said slowly. "There's a pattern," Clara said, "and a pattern can be used." The two men looked at each other again, and this time the look was different. Something in it she couldn't entirely read, but which seemed to involve a reassessment. Cordeller finished his coffee. "You're a different kind of woman than I expected up here," he said, which Clara was beginning to think was going to be the defining sentence of her life on this mountain. "So I've been told," she said, and picked up the land claim paper and read it again from the beginning, looking for the edges of the thing, the places where it might come apart. Outside, the last of the winter snow was still heavy on the pine boughs, bending them toward the ground under the weight. But the light was changing, longer in the afternoons now, a different quality to the cold, less final than January's cold, more like something that was on its way out rather than something that intended to stay. Spring was coming. Not here yet, not fully, but moving toward them through the mountains, and with it, Clara understood, everything that lived on this land was going to have to decide what it would do when the men with money and forged papers arrived to take what wasn't theirs. She folded the claim paper in half and set it beside the strongbox Rhett had pulled from under the floor, and she looked at the deed inside. Real, dated, witnessed, the ink faded but legible, and she thought, "We have something they didn't expect us to have. She just had to figure out how to use it." Cord. Eller left the next morning with a list Clara had written on the back of a supply receipt. Names, dates, parcel numbers pulled from the deed and the survey records, specific questions for the clerk in Barlow's Creek. She had been up past midnight putting it together, sitting at the table with the strongbox open and a candle burning low while Rhett slept, or tried to. She had heard him turn twice behind the curtain and knew he wasn't sleeping any better than she was. He found her still at the table when he got up before dawn. "You should have slept," he said. "I will tonight," she said. "Look at this." She spread the survey records across the table and pointed to the parcel boundaries marked in faded ink. The Harlow Syndicate's claim cuts across here, this corner, southeast. But if you look at the original territorial survey from 12 years ago, before you filed, this boundary marker was a creek junction. That creek junction moved after the flood of 1871, which means their claim is drawn from a reference point that no longer exists the way their document says it does. Rhett looked at the maps. He was quiet for a long moment. "That's a thin argument," he said finally. "It's a starting point," she said. "Thin is better than nothing." He looked at her across the table, at the candle burned to a nub and the papers spread in the half-dark, at the ink stains on her fingers from writing all night. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and looked at the maps himself. And they spent the next 2 hours going through everything in the strongbox together. And by the time the light came through the west window, Clara had 3 separate irregularities in the syndicate's claim that might, in front of the right judge, amount to something. Might. She knew it wasn't enough. She knew it the way you know a roof is holding, but can hear the strain in the timbers. Well, the men came in April, when the snow was still deep in the shadowed draws, but the south-facing slopes had opened up to mud and new grass. There were 6 of them, riding up the main trail from the valley in the mid-morning, and Clara saw them from the ridge above the cabin where she had gone to check the upper trap line. She counted them twice to be sure. 6, well-mounted, and the last 2 had rifles across their saddles in the open way men carry rifles when they want you to notice them. She came down off the ridge fast, not running but close to it, and got to the cabin 3 minutes before they reached the clearing. 6, she told Rhett, 2 with rifles showing. The one in front is dressed better than the others. Rhett was already moving to the window. He looked out through the gap in the shutter and his jaw tightened. "I know the one in front," he said. "His name is Casper Webb. He manages field operations for Voss, does the face-to-face work, so Voss doesn't have to get his hands on anything." "You've dealt with him before?" "He came through 2 years ago, said he was surveying for a mining concern." His voice was flat. "I told him to get off my land. And now he's back with 5 friends." "Now he's back with 5 friends," Rhett said. He went to the corner where his rifle leaned and checked the load with the particular efficiency of a man for whom this was muscle memory. Clara went to her own side of the cabin and retrieved the smaller rifle she'd been learning to shoot since February. Not well enough, she thought, not for what this might become, but well enough for close range. She checked it the way Rhett had taught her and stood to one side of the door. "Stay back from the window," he said. "I'm not going to hide in here while you—" "I'm not asking you to hide," he said. "I'm asking you to stay back from the window so they can't see how many of us there are and can't get a line on you before I know what they want." That was different. She moved to the side wall. Webb knocked on the door with the unhurried confidence of a man who expected it to open. Rhett opened it and stood in the frame, filling it, the rifle not raised but held in a way that made its presence clear. "Blackstone," Webb said. He had a pleasant enough face, wide, sun-reddened, with the practiced ease of a man who did this kind of work regularly and had learned that a certain surface charm made it go smoother. "Good to see you're still up here. I wasn't sure after the winter." "Webb," Rhett said. "What do you want?" "I'm here on behalf of the Harlow Syndicate." Webb reached into his coat and produced a folded document, holding it out. "I think you're going to want to read this." "I've read your land claim," Rhett said. He didn't take the paper. Webb's pleasant expression adjusted slightly, not dropping, just recalibrating. "Then you know the situation. The syndicate holds a valid claim to this parcel as of October last year. We're prepared to be generous. We're offering compensation for your improvements and relocation costs. Reasonable terms given the circumstances." "Your claim is fraudulent," Rhett said. "The boundary references a creek junction that changed course 4 years ago. The claim is invalid." Something moved through Webb's face then. Not surprise exactly, but the expression of a man who had expected an easy conversation and found a different one. His eyes moved briefly past Rhett's shoulder into the cabin, and Clara pressed herself flatter against the wall, heart going harder than she wanted it to. "I'd encourage you not to make this difficult," Webb said. His voice had lost some of the pleasant. "The syndicate has considerable resources, and the courts in this territory move slowly. By the time any dispute is resolved, the mining operation will be well established, and any claim you have will be worth considerably less than what we're offering right now." "Get off my land," Rhett said. The silence that followed had a specific quality. Clara had felt it before, on the mountain. The moment before weather broke, when everything went very still and the air tightened. Webb folded the paper back into his coat. "We'll be in touch," he said, in a tone that was the opposite of how those words usually sound. He turned his horse, and the 5 men behind him turned with him, and they rode back down the trail, and Clara finally let out the breath she'd been holding for the last 4 minutes. She came to the door and stood beside Rhett, and they watched until the riders were out of sight in the trees. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes," he said, "with more than 6. They came back 11 days later with 9 men and an ultimatum delivered on paper, giving Rhett 48 hours to vacate the property. In those 11 days, Clara had not been idle. She had ridden down to Barlow's Creek herself, a full day's ride, to meet with the land records clerk Cord Eller had mentioned, a meticulous, anxious man named Pruitt, who wore his nervousness like a second coat, but who had, as Cord had suggested, a conscience that gave him trouble at night. Pruitt had confirmed what she suspected. The Harlow Syndicate had filed 17 claims across the Caldwell Range in the past 2 years. Of those, 11 had been uncontested, families and solo settlers who had taken the compensation or simply disappeared rather than fight. 3 were in dispute in the territory court, moving at the speed of cold tar. 3, including Rhett's, were newly filed. "How many of these claims do you think are legitimate?" she asked Pruitt directly. The clerk looked at the window. "That's not really my place to—" "Mr. Pruitt," she said. "How many?" He looked back at his desk. 4, he said quietly. "Maybe 5. The rest—" He stopped. "There are irregularities. The kind of irregularities that happen when someone has good legal resources and is counting on nobody looking closely." "I'm looking closely," Clara said. "I need copies of the filings for every syndicate claim in this territory. Everyone." Pruitt's hands went still on his desk. That's a considerable amount of—" "I'll pay for the copies," she said, "and I'll be here tomorrow to pick them up." She rode back up the mountain that night under a half moon, with the copies rolled in oilskin in her saddlebag, her back aching from the ride and her mind running fast over what she had. It wasn't complete. It wasn't the clean, irrefutable proof she needed, but it was beginning to take shape. When she got back to the cabin, she found Rhett had not been idle either. He had ridden the property boundaries and marked out, in his own careful notation, every natural feature of the terrain: the narrow passes, the rockfall zones, the draws that became impassable mud in rain, the ridge lines that offered view of every approach to the cabin. He spread his notes on the table beside her documents, and they looked at both together, and Clara felt the 2 things join in her mind the way rivers join, not cleanly, but forming something larger than either one alone. "If they come in force," she said, "they'll come up the main trail. It's the only route that'll handle that many horses." "Unless they split," Rhett said. "Webb's smart enough to split them, send the main group up the trail and flank from the East Ridge. The East Ridge approach goes through that rockfall section, the one you marked here." She pointed. "How stable is that?" Rhett looked at the mark. "Not very," he said slowly. "Not if something were to disturb it." Clara looked at him. He was looking at the map with an expression she was learning to recognize, the quiet, methodical working through of a problem that he did before he spoke about it. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking," he said, "that the mountain can do a lot of the work for us if we're smart about how we ask it." They talked until well past midnight, and what they built between them in those hours was not a battle plan exactly. Neither of them wanted a battle, wanted the violence of it, the irrevocability of men shooting at other men on a mountain. What they built was a sequence of contingencies, a shape the situation might take, and the responses to each shape, and within that framework, the specific features of the terrain that could be used not to hurt men but to stop them, to disorient and delay and discourage. The traps Clara had learned to set all winter were part of it. Not the small ones, or not anything meant for an animal's leg. Larger mechanisms, trip lines across the east approach that would rattle enough noise to wake them from dead sleep and collapse the narrow section of trail. A section of the main trail where water could be diverted from the creek above to turn the path to mud in under an hour. The rockfall on the east ridge, which Rhett said he could disturb with a well-placed shot into the right fracture point, sending enough rock down the approach to block it without endangering anyone who hadn't already committed to coming up it with guns. This only works if they come and we're ready before they are, Clara said. We have the 48 hours, Rhett said. We'll be ready. And if it's not enough, if they push through regardless, Rhett was quiet. Then it gets harder, he said. I need you to tell me what happens in that version, she said. I need to actually know, not the softened version of it. He looked at her across the table. In that version, people get hurt, he said, maybe killed. And the law in this territory is slow enough that even if we're right on paper, if Voss decides to take this property by force, the legal remedy comes after the fact. He paused. After, which doesn't help us much while it's happening. Clara sat with that. The candle between them burned and threw shadows. Outside, the mountain was dark and quiet, and she could hear the creek somewhere below and the wind in the upper pines. And she thought about all the mornings she had gone out into it and learned its particular language. And she thought about the photograph above the fireplace. Josie and May, gone in a winter fire that might have been set by men like Webb. And she thought about Rhett's stillness in the doorway when he'd told Webb to get off his land. Then we make sure the paper is irrefutable before they arrive, she said. We don't just have our deed, we have 17 claims with irregularities. We have a pattern. If I can get that in front of the right person. Who? Rhett said. The territory court moves. Not the court, she said. A territorial marshal. If the syndicate is running a fraudulent land scheme across 17 parcels, that's not a civil matter. That's fraud. That's a criminal matter, and a marshal has authority that the civil courts don't. Rhett stared at her. Where do you get a territorial marshal? Cord said there was one stationed out of the territory capital who had been making noise about land fraud for the past year. He mentioned it, said Voss had been careful to stay just inside the civil boundaries so far. She spread the syndicate's filings across the table. But this, she tapped the papers, this isn't just inside the civil boundaries. This is 17 counts of fraudulent claim filing, potentially more. If the marshal sees this whole picture and not just one piece of it, Cord could get it to him, Rhett said. Cord is a day and a half out, she said. We have 48 hours. They looked at each other. I can make the ride, she said. Clara, I've ridden that trail a dozen times now. I know it. And I ride faster than Cord does. You know I do. She looked at him steadily. You stay here. You set the approaches the way we planned. I ride to where I can get a wire to Cord and tell him what we need, and then I ride to Barlow's Creek, and I put the full package of documents in front of Pruitt, and I ask him to sign an affidavit about what he's seen in those filings. She paused. He won't want to, but I think he will. He's been sitting on this for 2 years, and it's eating him. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, moved through the pines, faded. The candle flame straightened. If they come before your back, he said. Then you hold, she said. You know this mountain better than they ever will. You hold, and you don't let them reach the cabin, and I will be back. Something moved through his expression, not fear for himself, she didn't think. Something else. Something that had to do with the photograph above the fireplace, and a homestead 15 miles south, and a winter night 7 years ago. I'm not Josie, she said quietly, and I'm not leaving. I'm going to go get what we need and come back. That's all. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, short and deliberate. Ride fast, he said. I will, she said. She started rolling the documents into the oilskin. And Rhett. What? If they come before I'm back, don't take chances you don't have to. The land matters. You matter more. He looked at the table. That's a complicated thing to say to a man who's been up here alone for 8 years. I know, she said. I'm saying it anyway. She left before dawn, riding hard down the mountain with the oilskin saddlebag and the cold at her back and the stars still bright above the peaks. The trail was mud in the lower sections and rock above, and she pushed the horse through both, and when she hit the valley floor, she pushed harder. Behind her, somewhere above on the north face, Rhett was already moving through the dark with a length of rope and a working knowledge of where every loose stone on the east ridge sat. And Clara rode south with the whole weight of the mountain behind her, and the picture of 17 fraudulent land claims spread across a table burning clear in her mind. She had 48 hours. She intended to use every minute of them. She made it to Barlow's Creek in just under 9 hours. The horse was lathered and blowing when she pulled up at the telegraph office, and Clara's legs were shaking when she hit the ground. Not from fear, but from the simple physical fact of 9 hours in the saddle over rough terrain, the last 2 in the dark with only the trail's shape to guide her. She tied the horse at the post and went inside with the oilskin under her arm, and the clerk behind the counter looked at the state of her, mud-splashed, hair half down, breathing hard, with the expression of a man encountering something outside his usual Tuesday. "I need to send a wire," she said, "and then I need to find Elias Pruitt." The wire went to Cord Eller at the address Rhett had given her, a boarding house in a town called Sellers Ford, where Cord had mentioned he wintered. She kept it short because she had to, and because short was harder to misread. Harlow Syndicate moving on Blackstone parcel. Have 17 filings with irregularities. Need territorial marshal contact urgently. Ride if you can. C. She paid for the wire and walked the 3 blocks to the land records office in the dark, with the clock on the courthouse reading just past 9 in the evening, and she knocked on the door of the residence attached to the back of the building, which was where Pruitt lived, because a man who maintained land records in a town this size did not keep them far from where he slept. Pruitt answered in his nightshirt with a lamp in one hand and a look of deep alarm on his face. His alarm did not improve when he saw who it was. "Mrs. Blackstone," he said, It's past 9 o'clock." "I know what time it is," she said. "I need an hour of your time, and then you can go back to sleep. May I come in?" He let her in, which told her something about him, that despite his nervousness and his obvious discomfort, he had not closed the door on her. She sat at his kitchen table and spread the documents out and walked him through everything she had built in the past 11 days. The 17 claims, the specific irregularities in each, the boundary reference discrepancies, 3 instances of witness signatures she had reason to believe were falsified, and the clear pattern that emerged when you laid all 17 filings side by side and looked at them as a single operation rather than 17 separate claims. Pruitt sat across from her with his hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee he'd forgotten to heat, and he went through the documents one by one, and his face did the thing that faces do when a person has been carrying a truth they haven't been able to say, and someone finally says it in front of them. "I knew," he said quietly when he got to the end. "I knew something was wrong with these filings. I noted 3 of the discrepancies myself, and I sent a query to the Territory Land Office and received a reply that the filings had been reviewed and found to be in order." He set down the last paper. "When the Territory Land Office tells you something is in order, you have a limited number of options." "Who in the Territory Land Office?" Clara said. Pruitt looked at her. "A deputy commissioner named Halford. He's been in that position for 4 years. He paused. "Denton Voss has been operating in this territory for 3. Clara sat back. "Halford is Voss's man." "I have no proof of that," Pruitt said carefully. "No," she said. "But it's the explanation that fits." She looked at him. "Mr. Pruitt, I need you to write an affidavit. What you just told me, that you identified discrepancies, that you filed a query, that you received a reply from Halford saying the filings were in order. That's not an accusation. That's a factual account of what happened. Can you do that?" The clock on Pruitt's wall ticked 6 times while he didn't answer. "If Voss finds out I signed an affidavit against his filings," he started. "If Voss gets this land," she said, "he won't stop at our parcel. He has 13 more on this range already. He will keep going until every family on the Caldwell Range has been pushed off their land or bought out for a fraction of what it's worth, and the man in the territory office who's supposed to catch that is on his payroll." She held his gaze. You've been sitting on this for 2 years because there was no one to take it to. I'm telling you there's someone to take it to, but I need what you know on paper." Another long silence. "The territorial marshal," Pruitt said finally. "His name is Garrett Oakes. He's been trying to build a fraud case against the syndicate for 8 months. The problem has been documentation. The syndicate is careful enough that each individual filing, looked at alone, can be explained. But if someone brought him the full picture—" He stopped, looked at the documents on his table. "All 17 with the query I filed and Halford's response and a documented chain of the discrepancies. That's the case he can't explain away," Clara said. Pruitt got up from the table. He went to the cabinet in the corner where he kept his official stationery and came back with paper and a pen and an ink bottle, and he sat down and began to write, and Clara sat across from him and did not say anything else while he did it. He wrote for 40 minutes. She did not rush him. When he was finished, he signed it and blotted it and looked at her across the table. "Marshal Oakes works out of the territory capital," he said. "That's 3 days' hard ride." "Where does he travel?" she said. "Where does he operate in the field?" "He has a deputy stationed in a town called Crossfield, 40 miles south of here." Pruitt hesitated. "I don't know if the deputy has the same authority to act." "Who is the deputy?" "A man named Sutter, young but serious. He's been Oakes's deputy for 2 years. He paused. "I know him a little. He used to stop in here when he was passing through. He's the kind of man who reads his regulations carefully." "That's what I need," Clara said. She left Barlow's Creek at 11 that night with the affidavit in the oilskin alongside the rest, and she pushed south toward Crossfield on a horse that needed rest. She couldn't give it yet, and she rode through what was left of the dark thinking about Rhett. Alone on the mountain, setting his trip lines and his diversions and his rockfall triggers, and she pushed the thought of what might happen if the syndicate moved early to the back of her mind and kept it there by focusing on the road. She found Deputy Sutter at his office at 7 in the morning, which was where a serious young man who read his regulations would be. He was younger than Pruitt had suggested, mid-20s, thin, with the slightly startled look of someone who had prepared carefully for the job and was finding that the job kept presenting situations his preparation hadn't covered. Clara walked in and put the oilskin on his desk and said, "My name is Clara Blackstone. I have a fraudulent land claim being enforced on my property in the Caldwell Range right now. I have documentation of 17 fraudulent filings by the same operation, an affidavit from the Barlow's Creek Land Records clerk, and reason to believe a deputy commissioner in the Territory Land Office is complicit. I need you to ride with me today." Sutter stared at her. "Today," she repeated. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'd need to review Then review it fast," she said. "I have maybe 30 hours before my husband is outnumbered on a mountain with 9 armed men and a forged eviction order." He reviewed it. She watched him go through the documents with the focused attention of a man who was, as Pruitt had said, serious about his work. And she watched the moment when the full shape of it became clear to him. Not a single disputed claim, but a systematic, territory-wide operation, shielded by a corrupt official, that had already displaced 11 families from their land. He looked up from the papers. "The affidavit from Pruitt. He signed this freely?" "He did," she said. "He's been wanting to sign something like that for 2 years." Sutter was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and went to the back room where his gear was. "I'll need to wire Marshal Oakes," he called through the door. "Wire him from the road," she said. "There's a telegraph station in Millhaven, 20 miles north. We can hit it on the way." A pause. "You already mapped the route?" "I mapped it last night," she said. "Can you ride?" He came back through the door with his coat on and his rifle in hand and the expression of a young man who had just decided something about himself. "I can ride," he said. They made Millhaven by noon. Sutter sent his wire to Marshal Oakes from the station there, a detailed summary of what he'd reviewed, what he intended to do, and a request for backup to follow as soon as Oakes could arrange it. The station operator, a woman of about 60 who read the wire twice with visible interest before sending it, looked at Clara when she was done and said, "You're the one that's got the land trouble on Caldwell Range?" "News travels," Clara said. "Cord Eller came through here last night heading north," the woman said. He asked me to tell anyone who looked like they were connected to the Blackstone parcel that he's bringing 2 men who owe him favors, and they'll be at the mountain before sunset. Clara felt something in her chest release that she hadn't fully known was coiled. "Thank you," she said. "Eller's a good man," the station operator said. "You tell Rhett Blackstone that Margaret Tully said to hold on." "I'll tell him," Clara said. Forward. They hit the base of the mountain at 4 in the afternoon. Clara heard it before she saw it. Not gunfire, not yet, but the sound carried on the mountain air that meant men moving through terrain in numbers, the particular noise of horses on rock, and voices not bothering to stay quiet. She pulled up, and Sutter pulled up beside her, and they listened. "East side," she said. "How many?" "Can't tell from here." She looked at the trail. "The main trail goes up here. There's a secondary approach east that they may be using to flank. Rhett knew they might split. If they're already on the mountain, then we go up the main trail and we go fast," she said, and pushed her horse into the climb before he finished the sentence. The main trail was hard going after the winter, soft in the lower sections, rocky and steep above the tree line, requiring the horses to pick their way with care that cost time she didn't have. She could hear more now, clear as they climbed. Voices somewhere above and to the right. The east approach, she thought. And then, close and sharp, the sound of something large giving way on the ridge, a rumble of moving rock that echoed off the peaks, and the voices on the east approach got suddenly louder, and then very suddenly quieter. The rockfall. Rhett had triggered the rockfall on the east ridge, which meant they were close enough to the cabin that he'd had to use it. She pushed the horse harder and came around the last bend in the trail into the clearing in front of the cabin. And the scene she found there was not the ambush she had feared, but it was close enough to make her heart knock against her ribs. 4 of Webb's men were in the clearing, on foot, their horses tied at the tree line. Webb himself was 20 yards from the cabin door, and Rhett was in the doorway with his rifle leveled, and the particular geometry of those positions told Clara everything about what had been happening for the last hour. Webb's group had made it up the main trail and reached the cabin, and Rhett had kept them out of it, and the standoff had been holding, but holding was not a permanent condition. She rode into the clearing and pulled up hard between Webb and the cabin door, which was not the careful and considered thing to do, but consideration was a luxury she didn't have. Webb's men went for their weapons and stopped when Sutter rode in right behind her with his badge visible and his rifle raised. "Deputy Sutter," Clara said loudly, clearly to the clearing. "Territorial Marshal's office." The sound of that moved through Webb's men the way cold water moves through a room. A visible, physical reaction, the readjustment of bodies and hands and intentions. Webb had not moved. He stood his ground and looked at Sutter with the calculating expression of a man running numbers. "Deputy," he said, "this is a civil matter. We have a valid land claim. You have 17 fraudulent land claims," Sutter said. His voice was steadier than Clara expected from a man his age in a clearing with 4 armed men. "I have documentation of each one, a signed affidavit from a land records clerk attesting to irregularities in the filing process, and I have reason to believe a territory official has been complicit in approving fraudulent documents." He kept his rifle level. "That's not a civil matter, Mr. Webb. That's criminal fraud. And I'm placing you under arrest pending a full investigation." The silence that followed was the longest Clara had ever experienced. It lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained about 40 years' worth of decisions being made and unmade. Then one of Webb's men took a step back toward the horses, and the geometry of the clearing shifted, and what happened in the next 3 minutes was loud and confused and did not go smoothly. One man bolted and Sutter went after him. 2 others looked at each other and made the calculation that 4-to-1 odds had just become considerably less appealing, and the 4th, a heavy-set man who had been watching the whole thing from near the trees, put his hands up with the air of someone who had seen the way this was going for some time and had made his peace with it. Webb himself didn't run. Clara had not expected him to run. He was not that kind of man. He stood in the clearing while his hired men made their various decisions around him, and he looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not defeated, not yet, but the look of a man who was recalculating what came next. "You think this stops Voss?" he said, when the noise had settled. I think it starts something that stops Voss, she said. That's different. He has lawyers, Webb said. He has money. He has Halford, she said. And Halford's name is in Pruitt's affidavit. That's the part that stops him. Something crossed Webb's face. A flicker of something that might have been surprise or might have been the recognition that the woman in front of him had reached further than he'd expected. You put Halford in an affidavit, he said. I didn't, she said. Pruitt did. I just asked the right question. Rhett came out of the cabin doorway and walked across the clearing to stand beside her. He looked at her, at the mud and the exhaustion and the oilskin saddlebag, and the fact that she was there, had come back as she said she would. And he did not say anything, but he put his hand briefly on her arm, the particular touch of a man who has been doing the math on a bad outcome for 30 hours and is adjusting his figures. There were 3 on the east approach, he said. They're not going anywhere. The rockfall blocked the trail. He looked at Sutter, who was coming back across the clearing with the man who had bolted, considerably less enthusiastic than when he'd left. You're the law? Deputy Sutter, Clara said. He came. Rhett looked at the deputy. You'll need to get men up the east trail, he said. The 3 up there aren't armed anymore. A pause that contained a complete story. But they'll need an escort down. What did you do? Clara said. I made it clear to them that their rifles were less useful than they thought, he said in a tone that closed the subject. Cordeller arrived 40 minutes later with 2 men Clara didn't know, but who had the look of people Cord had accumulated over a long life of being the kind of person other people owed things to. They came up the trail to find Webb in restraints, 3 men coming down off the East Ridge under Rhett's watch, Sutter writing in his notebook with the focused energy of a man who understood that everything he put down in the next hour was going to matter in a court of law, and Clara sitting on the step of the cabin with her boots off, because her feet had been in those boots for 37 hours, and she had reached the end of her ability to be reasonable about it. Cord looked at her. He looked at the clearing, at the state of affairs, at Rhett coming back down from the ridge, and then he looked at her again. You did all this, he said. It wasn't quite a question. We did all this, she said, and nodded toward Rhett. Cord looked at Rhett, who had come to stand at the edge of the clearing. Some communication passed between the 2 old men that Clara wasn't party to, the kind of look that covers a lot of shared history in a short space. She's something, Cord said. Yes, Rhett said. She is. The sun was going down behind the western peaks, painting the snow on the high ridges orange and then pink and then a deep darkening red, and the mountain went quiet the way it went quiet at day's end. Not peacefully exactly, but with the particular relief of something that had been under pressure easing off. One by one, the things that needed doing got done. Sutter organized his prisoners and his paperwork. Cord and his men set up camp at the edge of the clearing. The horses got seen to. Clara went inside and made coffee on the fire because it was the practical thing to do and because she needed something to do with her hands while her body remembered that it was exhausted, and Rhett came in and sat at the table and did not say much and didn't need to. Webb said this doesn't stop Voss, she said, pouring. He's right, Rhett said. This doesn't stop Voss. It starts the thing that stops Voss. She looked at him. That's what I said. I know, he said. I heard you. He wrapped his hands around the cup. You got to Pruitt, got the affidavit. Halford's name is in it, she said. Once Oak sees that and starts pulling on that thread, the whole thing comes apart, Rhett said. He looked at his coffee. 17 families. 11 who already lost their land, she said. Maybe some of it can be restored. I don't know. That's for the courts now. She sat down across from him. Sutter is good. He'll make sure Oakes gets the full picture. Rhett nodded slowly. Outside, Cord's voice carried on the evening air, saying something to one of his men, and somewhere up on the east ridge a loose stone shifted and fell, and the mountain resettled itself with the absolute indifference to human events that was one of the things Clara had come, over the past months, to find oddly comforting. You said you'd come back, Rhett said. I did, she said. I know, he said. He stopped, turned the cup in his hands. I'm not good at people not coming back. She looked at him across the table. This man who had built himself a life specifically designed to minimize the number of things that could be taken from him, who had gone 8 years on this mountain, making himself self-sufficient against the particular cruelty of loss. She thought about Josie and May and the homestead 15 miles south, and the year he'd spent trying to find out what happened, and then stopped trying and came further up the mountain instead. "I know you're not," she said. "That's why I told you before I left, so you'd know it wasn't that kind of leaving." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're the most unexpected thing that has ever happened to me, and I have had some unexpected things happen to me." It was the most he had said about what she meant to him in the entire time she had been on this mountain, and it arrived so quietly and directly that it landed differently than a declaration would have. She felt it in her chest the way you feel cold air, immediate and real and slightly difficult to breathe through. "I'm going to hold that over you for a very long time," she said. The edge of his mouth moved. "I know," he said. Outside the window, the last light was leaving the peaks, and the clearing was settling into the particular companionable noise of people making camp, and the mountain held them in its cold and its quiet, and the coffee was hot, and for now, not permanently, not without complication, because nothing on this mountain was without complication. For now, it was enough. Marshal Garrett Oakes arrived on the mountain 6 days after the standoff in the clearing, and he was not what Clara had expected. She had built a picture of him from Pruitt's description and Sutter's deference. A serious man, a careful man, someone who read regulations and followed procedure. What rode up the main trail on a gray horse was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a drooping gray mustache and the kind of unhurried manner that either meant he was slow or meant he had nothing left to prove. And within 10 minutes of sitting at Clara's table with her coffee and her documents, it became clear it was the latter. He went through everything she had assembled without speaking. Pruitt's affidavit, the 17 filings, her own notes on the boundary discrepancies, the query Pruitt had filed, and Halford's response. He read it all the way. A man reads something he intends to use, not casually, but with the focused attention of someone building a structure in his mind, placing each piece where it would bear the most weight. When he finished, he set the last paper down and looked across the table at Clara. "You put this together yourself," he said. "My husband had the original deed and survey records," she said. "The land records clerk had the knowledge. I just connected what was already there." Oakes looked at Rhett, who was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, and then back at Clara. "Pruitt's been sitting on this for 2 years," he said. "He needed someone to ask the right question," she said. Oakes picked up the affidavit again. "Halford." He said the name the way you say a word you've been waiting to say for a long time. "I've had Halford's name in the back of my mind for 14 months. Couldn't get to him from any angle. Every time I got close, the documentation was just clean enough." He set the paper down. "This isn't just clean enough." "No," Clara said, "it isn't." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't categorize, something between respect and the kind of frank appraisal that didn't need to be flattering, to be honest. "Mrs. Blackstone," he said, "in 22 years of this work, I have had approximately 3 civilians bring me something I could actually use. You're the 4th. "I just want my land back," she said. "You'll get your land back," he said, "and Voss is going to have a considerably harder year than he planned for." Denton Voss was arrested in the territory capital 7 weeks later. Halford was arrested the same day, at his office in the Land Commissioner's building, and the story that came out over the following months in the territory's legal proceedings was larger than even Clara had suspected. Not 17 fraudulent claims, but 23, spanning 3 counties, representing a coordinated operation that had been running for nearly 4 years. The deputy commissioner had been approving syndicate filings and bearing challenges for a flat fee paid quarterly through a land holding company that existed only on paper. Clara followed the proceedings from the mountain in the letters Sutter sent her and the occasional newspaper Cordeller brought up when he passed through. The legal machinery was slow and imperfect, and several things that should have been simple turned out not to be, and there were moments when she read an update and felt the frustration of watching justice move at the pace of cold water through rock. But it moved. Oakes was thorough and Sutter was meticulous, and Pruitt, having signed his name to the affidavit and survived the initial terror of having done so, turned out to be a remarkably detailed witness with a memory for filing dates and document numbers that proved invaluable. Webb entered a plea that reduced his sentence in exchange for testimony against Voss. Halford did not, and consequently did considerably worse in court. Voss himself hired 4 lawyers and spent 8 months fighting it, which was exactly the kind of resource advantage that had made the scheme work for so long. But Oakes had built the case wide enough and deep enough that there was no single thread Voss could pull to unravel it, and by the following spring, Denton Voss was looking at 12 years in the territorial penitentiary and an order to pay restitution to 11 displaced families. 11 families. Clara thought about that number in the evening, sitting by the fire. 11 families who had taken compensation or simply been pushed out, whose land had passed into the syndicate's holdings and been stripped of its original purpose. The court ordered restoration of title, where the land hadn't already been developed, and for the others, financial settlement, which was imperfect. You could not give a family back the years they had spent somewhere else, the homestead work that was now someone else's, the particular grief of losing land you had built a life on. That was the part that didn't resolve cleanly. Clara had learned enough about loss by now to understand that some things didn't resolve, they just changed shape. But the land was stopped, the operation was dismantled, and that was not nothing. That was in fact the most that could reasonably be done, and she had learned also to take what could be done and not hollow it out by grieving what couldn't. The news reached Red Hollow in the way news reached small frontier towns, not all at once, but in pieces, accumulating over weeks, carried by travelers and tradespeople and the slow telegraph of community gossip. Cordeller, who seemed to have a gift for being present at the moment a story needed carrying, spent a considerable amount of time in the saloon in Red Hollow over the summer. And what he said there, factually, without embellishment, because Cord had no gift for embellishment and knew it, traveled outward from that saloon the way water travels from a stone dropped in still water. Clara heard about it secondhand from Tom Hargrove, who rode up the mountain in July with a load of supplies she hadn't ordered and the barely suppressed energy of a man carrying news he's pleased about. "Town's talking," he told her, over coffee on the cabin step, in the particular directness of a man who had always been straight with her. "About what you did, what you found, the affidavit, and the marshal, and all of it." "I imagine they're talking," she said. "Not the way they used to talk," he said. He looked at his cup. "Clara, I was one of the people standing in that square. I didn't laugh, but I stood there and I didn't say anything, and that was—" He stopped. "I should have said something, when Douglas left. When they laughed, I should have." She looked at the old man who had given her 12 years of steady work and never once been unkind to her, who had also never once stood up for her in a way that cost him anything. She thought about what to say and settled on the truth. "You could have," she said. "But you didn't, and I left. And what I found up here is better than anything Red Hollow ever offered me. So I find it hard to be as angry about that as I probably should be." Hargrove was quiet. "The place has changed," he said finally. "Some of it. Not all of it. Small towns don't change all at once. But people know your name differently now. Even the ones who—" He trailed off. "Even the ones who laughed," she said. "Even them," he said. "It matters, Clara. What you did matters to people in ways they're having trouble saying." She thought about that after he rode back down the mountain. She thought about whether it mattered to her. What Red Hollow said, how Red Hollow said her name now, whether the shift from mockery to respect was something she needed. She sat with the question honestly, the way she had learned to sit with things up here, without rushing to a comfortable answer. What she found was, it mattered some. She was human enough to feel the difference, to notice the absence of something that had sat in her chest for 26 years. Not the wound exactly. The wound was something she'd have the rest of her life in some form, but the specific daily pressure of it, the weight of being publicly dismissed, the stone in the boot. That was lighter now. She was not going to pretend otherwise. But it was not what she had done it for. She had done it for the land and for Rhett, and for the 11 families and for Pruitt's 2 years of sitting on something he couldn't say, and for the basic principle that what was fraudulent should not be allowed to stand simply because the person committing the fraud had more resources than the people it was committed against. The respect that came after was a consequence, not a purpose, and she thought that was an important distinction. That if you did the right thing because of how it would make people regard you, you were building on the wrong foundation. People's regard was too changeable, too dependent on factors outside your control, too similar to the weather in its refusal to stay consistent. What you built on the inside was yours. That held. The winter that followed was the worst in a decade on the Caldwell Range. It came early, late October, which even Rhett hadn't predicted with his usual accuracy, though he came close. And it came hard and stayed hard, with snowfall that buried the valley settlements and temperatures that cracked the bark on the old pines, and a wind that found every gap in every structure and made its presence known. The homesteaders in the valley were unprepared. The season had been mild through September, and people had been slow to complete their winter preparations, and by November it was clear that several settlements were in serious trouble. Not enough food stored, roofs that weren't built for this weight of snow, stock that was dying from exposure. Red Hollow was among them. The word came up the mountain with a trapper named Finch who passed through in early November, half frozen himself and carrying the information with the dazed urgency of a man who had been moving through catastrophe and couldn't quite get ahead of it. 3 families in the valley had already abandoned their homesteads. The settlement's food stores were a third of what they should be. The main road south was blocked by a drift that would take a crew of 20 men a week to clear. Rhett looked at Clara after Finch had been fed and warmed and sent on his way. "You're already thinking about it," he said. "I've been thinking about it for 3 days," she said, "since the second big snowfall." "Tell me." She had been, in fact, building it in her mind the way she had built the case against the syndicate, methodically, accounting for what existed and what was needed and where the gaps were. "The mountain route," she said. "The trail we use for the upper trap line. The one that comes down the west face and hits the old forestry track. That track connects to Red Hollow's north end. It's not passable for wagons, but it's passable for pack horses. If we run supply lines through the upper trap line, Rhett said. He was quiet for a moment. "In this weather, that trail is going to be—" "I know what it's going to be," she said. "I've been on it in bad weather. Not this bad. But I know it. Clara, there are families down there who are going to lose children to this winter," she said. It came out flat and certain because it was. She had seen enough of what cold did when it had time and opportunity. "I know what that trail is. I also know it can be done. We'd need help. We can't run it just the 2 of us." Rhett sat back. She watched him work through it. Not whether, she realized, but how. He had already passed the weather without making a production of it. "Cord," he said. "Cord, and whoever Cord can bring. And there are 2 homesteaders on the south face, the Aldermans and the family that came up in August, the Prices. They're provisioned well, I think. If they'd contribute—" "They would," he said. "Alderman would. I'd have to explain the situation, but he'd come." They rode to the Aldermans the next morning and to the Prices the day after, breaking trail through snow that came to the horses' chests in the deep sections. And both families were exactly what Rhett had said they would be. Not immediately enthusiastic, not without their own concerns and limitations, but fundamentally willing, in the way that people in isolated places develop a willingness that flatter places don't require because the need doesn't make itself as visible. Cord arrived 4 days later with 3 men and 2 extra pack horses, and the matter-of-fact energy of someone who had received a letter that said, "Come and had come." The supply route they built over the following 2 weeks was not elegant. It was cold and grueling, and the trail was exactly as bad as Rhett had predicted. Worse in 2 sections, where the wind had packed the snow into a hard crust that broke through unpredictably and sent horses stumbling and riders into drifts up to their waists. Clara fell twice in the first week and pulled a muscle in her right shoulder on the second day that made every trip after it a specific kind of misery she managed by not talking about it. One of Cord's men turned back after the first run, which Clara didn't blame him for, but which meant redistributing the loads, and she redistributed them without comment and kept going. They ran the route every 3 days. Food, medicine, lamp oil, extra wool blankets. On the 4th run, they brought down 2 families whose situations were too precarious to stay. A woman with 3 small children whose husband had broken his leg in a fall and couldn't help with wood or water, and an elderly man living alone whose stove had cracked and who was surviving on cold provisions and stubbornness. Red Hollow received them. That was the simple fact of it. The town that had laughed at Clara Whitmore in an ivory dress opened its remaining resources to the people coming off the mountain. And she didn't read too much into that. People in emergencies often become more than they are in ordinary times, and ordinary times have a way of returning them to what they were. But she noticed it. She filed it alongside the other things the winter was teaching her. The runs continued until February, when a thaw opened the southern road and proper supply wagons could get through. By that point, 7 families had been stabilized who might not have been, and the 2 Clara had brought down had begun to find their footing in the settlement with the particular tenacity of people who had been through something and knew the difference between inconvenience and genuine hardship. She went back to Red Hollow once, in March, when the road was clear and the mountain was loosening its hold on the season. Not to make a point, not because she needed anything from the town. She went to return the horse she had borrowed from the livery 8 months ago, the one she'd ridden to Barlow's Creek on the night she'd gone to find Pruitt, because she was not a woman who returned things late if she could help it, and because there was something incomplete about a debt unpaid. The livery was being run by a young man who was not Douglas Pell, and who accepted the horse with a handshake and a nod and did not make a speech about it. She walked through town on her way back to where she'd tied her own horse. It was a Tuesday morning, cold still, the mud of the main street frozen in the overnight temperatures and softening in the sun. People she had known her entire life moved about their business. Some of them looked at her the way Tom Hargrove had described, differently, the recognition of her name behind their eyes now meaning something it hadn't before. Some of them didn't look at her at all, which was fine. She had not come for looks. She passed the town square. She did not stop there, did not stand in it and have a moment, because she was not the kind of woman who staged things for her own benefit. But she passed through the edge of it, and she felt the memory of the square on that October morning the way you feel an old injury in cold weather. Present, specific, no longer sharp, but there. She thought about the ivory dress. She had burned it in November when they were clearing out the cabin for winter, and she had gone through her trunk and found it at the bottom, and held it up in the light and looked at it for a long moment. It was still all right, technically, but she had no use for it up here, and keeping it felt like keeping the stone in the boot, a reminder of something she had decided she no longer needed to be reminded of. So she had fed it to the fire, and it had burned quickly, ivory fabric going orange and then black and then ash, and she had watched it go without ceremony and felt the lightness of a thing let go. What she kept instead was the morning she had stood in that square and not cried, the decision, made in about 2 seconds, not to give them that. She kept it not as a wound but as a fact about herself, that she was the kind of person who made that decision in that moment. That was worth carrying. The rest was just an old dress. Uptown. Spring came to the Caldwell Range the way it always came, argumentatively, taking 2 steps forward and 1 back, offering a week of warmth and then a late snow and then warmth again, until the snow conceded the lower elevations and retreated to the peaks where it lived year-round. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and the meadows went green almost overnight, and the elk came back to the south meadow in numbers Clara hadn't seen before, and the mornings had that quality again. The one she had first noticed and told Rhett she didn't have words for, the quality of light and cold and enormity that still, a year and a half later, arrived like something new. She was at the upper trapline on a morning in late April when she stopped on the ridge and looked out at the valley, the way she had done on that November morning the previous year when she'd thought about the ivory dress and the decision that had followed it. Below, the valley was green and immense, and Red Hollow was a small cluster of structures at its eastern edge, and the mountains were white above the tree line, and the sky was the particular blue that happened at altitude in spring, deep enough to fall into. She had been on this mountain 18 months. She had learned to move through it quietly. She had learned to read its weather and its terrain and its particular ways of trying to kill you if you weren't paying attention, and she had done that and learned the other things too. About a man who kept a photograph on his wall and whose stillness was not emptiness but the accumulated weight of things he had loved and lost, and about herself, about what existed in her when no one was weighing it and finding it insufficient. What existed was considerable. She had always suspected that. It had taken a mountain and a year and a half of work that left her hands rough and her legs strong and her mind more honest with itself than it had ever been to stop suspecting and simply know. Rhett came up behind her on the ridge, She heard him at about 12 feet now, which was as close as he could reliably get without her catching the sound, and he had stopped trying to beat it and started treating it as a joke they shared without naming. He stood beside her and looked at the valley. Sutter sent a letter, he said. Voss's appeal was denied. He reports to the penitentiary in June. Clara nodded. She had expected it, but expectation and confirmation were different things, and she let the confirmation settle. And the restitution, the 11 families? The court is processing the property restorations. Sutter says 4 of them are already back on their original land. The others, it's complicated. Some of the land was developed, but the financial settlements are moving. He paused. He also said Pruitt has been promoted, Deputy Land Commissioner. She laughed at that, a short surprise sound that the wind took and carried down the ridge. Good, she said. He earned it. Rhett was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines below them with that sound she had come to know. The particular sound of a good day, not too much weather in it, just the mountain breathing. This is a different life than you planned for, he said. It wasn't an apology. It was an observation, offered in the way he offered most things, straight, without decoration, as if he trusted her to do what she wanted with it. Yes, she said. It is. Is it? He stopped, tried again. Are you? Rhett, she said, because she knew what he was trying to ask, and she knew also that the asking was costing him something, that he was not a man who asked whether people were all right in the places they had come to be, because people he had loved had stopped being in those places, and the asking felt probably like something that could go wrong. I'm good, she said. I'm not all right in the way people say when they mean fine and don't mean anything by it. I mean, I'm actually good. Here, on this mountain, with this life. He looked at her. You are the most unexpected thing that ever happened to me too, she said. I meant to tell you that. I just waited until I was sure. Something in his face did the thing it did. The adjustment, the slight shift. The expression he had when something he had expected to be one way turned out to be another. And now you're sure, he said. Now I'm sure, she said. Below them the valley held its morning light, and the mountains held their snow, and the sky held everything under it without preference or opinion, the way the world holds all the lives being lived in it simultaneously. The 11 families finding their way back to land that had been stolen and returned, Pruitt at his new desk with his new title and his conscience finally quiet. Cordeller moving through the territory on whatever business came next. Sutter writing his careful letters. The people of Red Hollow going about the ordinary business of surviving another season. All of it happening at once, all of it mattering in its own specific way. That was the thing about living through something, Clara thought. You came out the other side changed in ways you could point to and ways you couldn't, and the world around you had also changed. And the relationship between you and that world was different in both directions. What it asked of you and what you were able to give. You couldn't always see it clearly while it was happening. You could only make the decisions that were in front of you and trust that the kind of person you were choosing to be in each of those moments would add up to something you could live with. She had stood in a town square in an ivory dress while people laughed at her, and she had decided in about 2 seconds not to give them her tears. That had been the first decision. Everything after it had followed from that one, not smoothly, not without cost, not in the way stories sometimes suggest these things go, but genuinely, imperfectly, with sore muscles and burned forearms and 37 hours in the saddle, and a shoulder that still ached in cold weather, and a life that looked nothing like anything she had planned. It turned out, she thought, that the life you didn't plan was sometimes the one that fit. She was not going to say that to Rhett. He would think about it for a week and then say something quiet and correct about it, and she would pretend to be annoyed by how long it had taken him. That was also something she had come to know about the two of them, that they were going to be fine, not because it was easy, but because neither of them was the kind of person who stopped doing the work. That was enough. In her experience, it was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. She turned away from the valley and started back down the ridge toward the upper trapline, moving through the spring snow with the sure footing of someone who knew exactly where she was, Rhett falling into step behind her, the mountain holding them both in its cold and its beauty and its absolute even-handed indifference. which was not cruelty, she had learned, but simply the condition under which everything real was asked to prove itself. She had proven herself. Not to Red Hollow, not to Rhett, not to anyone who had ever laughed at her or looked past her or assumed she would fold when the pressure came. To herself. That was the one that counted. That was the one that lasted.